Every morning, before the city fully woke up, the palace gates stood ready for the same old ritual. Tourists gathered along the black iron railings, cameras in hand, coffee cups steaming in the cold morning air. They came from every corner of the world just to watch a group of men in tall black hats stand perfectly still for hours. It sounded strange when you said it out loud. Why would anyone travel thousands of miles to watch someone not move? But there was something about it, something that pulled people in every single time. The guards were famous for one simple rule. They never spoke. They never smiled. They never reacted, no matter what happened in front of them. Children could scream. Dogs could bark. Someone could drop an entire tray of food right at their feet, and the guard would not even blink. It was tradition, passed down for hundreds of years, a symbol of discipline and loyalty to the crown. People loved testing them. Tourists would make funny faces, tell jokes, even try tickling the air near their noses, just hoping for a reaction. Most of the time, they got nothing, just silence, just stillness, just a man standing like a statue carved from history itself. But this story is not about the silence. It is about the moments when that silence quietly broke, just enough for the world to remember that behind every uniform, there is still a human heart beating. It started on a Tuesday morning that seemed like any other. The sky was a soft gray, the kind that hinted at rain but never quite delivered it. The crowd outside the palace gates was smaller than usual, mostly early risers and a few school groups on holiday trips. Among them stood a young guard named Oliver, only 4 months into his post. He was 24 years old, tall, with a jaw that stayed locked in place no matter how tired his feet were after hours of standing. To the tourists, he looked like every other guard. Same red coat, same tall black hat, same unreadable expression. But underneath that uniform, Oliver's mind was still adjusting to a life that demanded absolute control over every twitch, every breath, every flicker of feeling. Oliver had grown up in a small town far from the capital, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and the biggest event of the year was the local fair. His father had been a soldier, and his grandfather before him. Joining the guard was not just a job for Oliver. It was something he had dreamed about since he was a boy, sitting on his father's shoulders at parades, watching the guards march past with a kind of awe that never really left him. When he finally earned his place among them, it felt like stepping into a story he had been reading his whole life. The training had been brutal, not just physically, though there was plenty of that too, with hours of marching drills and inspections. The hardest part was learning to control his face. Instructors would stand inches from new recruits, shouting, laughing, even placing objects on their shoulders and heads just to test whether they would flinch. Oliver failed more times than he liked to admit in those early weeks. But slowly, he learned. He learned to let his mind go somewhere else entirely, while his body remained locked in position. He thought about his mother's garden back home, the smell of fresh bread, anything that helped him disappear behind the mask of duty. By the time he was assigned to gate duty, Oliver believed he had mastered it. Stillness had become second nature. He could stand for hours without so much as shifting his weight, watching the crowd through eyes that gave nothing away. He was proud of that discipline. It made him feel like he belonged to something bigger than himself. Life in the barracks was quieter than most people imagined. When the guards were off duty, they were ordinary young men again, joking over breakfast, complaining about sore feet, watching football matches on a small television in the common room. It always struck Oliver how strange the contrast was. The same men who stood like statues for hours in front of thousands of strangers could be found an hour later laughing over a card game or grumbling about the weather. The uniform, he came to understand, was not who they were. It was simply something they carried for a few hours each day, a role they stepped into and out of, the way an actor might step onto a stage and later return home. His roommates, 2 guards named Peter and Victor, had both served longer than Oliver, and often teased him gently about being the newest and youngest among them. Victor, in particular, had a habit of testing new recruits with silly jokes and impressions during meals, just to see who could keep a straight face even off duty. Oliver usually failed these tests spectacularly, bursting into laughter within seconds, which only made Victor try harder the next time. "You'll get there," Peter told him once, not unkindly, after Oliver had once again broken into laughter during one of Victor's impressions. "Give it a year. You'll be as boring as the rest of us." Oliver had laughed at that too, though a small part of him wondered whether becoming truly unshakable meant losing something important along the way. He never quite arrived at an answer, not in those early months, and perhaps not fully even after everything that happened later. That Tuesday morning, an elderly woman named Margaret arrived at the gates a little after 9. She moved slowly, leaning on a wooden cane that had clearly seen many years of use, its handle worn smooth from her grip. She was visiting the city for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Her husband had brought her here on their honeymoon, back when they were young and the world felt endless. He had passed away 3 years earlier, and this trip was something she had promised herself she would take, even if she had to do it alone. Margaret had read about the guards long before she ever saw them in person. Her husband used to tell her stories about watching the ceremony as a boy, how his own grandfather had once been part of the guard many decades ago. It was a small connection, but it mattered to her. Coming here again, watching the same ceremony they had watched together on their honeymoon, felt like closing a circle that had been left open since his death. She and her husband had been married for 46 years, a fact she still found herself surprised by whenever she said it out loud. They had met at a dance in their early 20s, both of them far too shy to speak to one another for nearly the entire evening, until he had finally worked up the courage to ask her name during the last song of the night. She often told the story to her grandchildren, laughing at how nervous he had looked, how his voice had cracked slightly on the second word. Their honeymoon to the city had been a modest affair, funded mostly by money saved from years of careful budgeting rather than any real luxury. They had stayed in a small guest house a short walk from the palace, spending their days wandering through parks and museums, their evenings sharing simple meals and quiet conversation. The morning they had watched the guard ceremony together remained one of her clearest memories from the entire trip, her husband's hand warm around hers as they stood among the crowd, both of them young and full of a future neither could yet fully imagine. After his passing, Margaret had found the house unbearably quiet in ways she had not expected. 46 years of shared routines, shared jokes, shared silences that never felt empty because he was simply there, had left a void that nothing quite seemed to fill. Her children encouraged her to travel, to stay busy, to find new hobbies and new company. She had tried, in her own way, joining a local gardening club and a weekly book group, but there remained a particular ache that only revisiting certain shared memories seemed able to soothe, even if only briefly. She found a spot near the front of the crowd, close enough to see the guards clearly. Her legs ached from the long walk from her hotel, but she did not mind. She had waited a long time for this moment. The morning air was cool against her face, and for a while she simply stood there, remembering. The ceremony began the way it always did. A group of guards marched into position with practiced precision, their boots striking the stone ground in perfect rhythm. The crowd fell into a hush, phones raised, eyes wide. Margaret watched closely, searching the row of still faces for any hint of the young men who once wore the same coats her husband used to describe. It happened quickly. One moment she was standing steady, and the next, her cane slipped slightly on a patch of damp stone. Her balance, never strong on good days, gave out completely. She felt herself tipping backward, the world tilting in that strange slow motion that comes right before a fall. There was no time to call out, no time to reach for anything. Oliver saw it happen from the corner of his eye. He was standing only a few feet away, positioned near the edge of the barrier. Every part of his training told him to stay still. Do not react. Do not move. Let nothing break the formation. But something inside him overruled all of that in half a second. Before his mind even finished processing the thought, his body was already moving. He stepped out of line, just enough to reach the barrier, and caught Margaret by the arm before she hit the ground. It was not a dramatic rescue. It was quick, almost clumsy, his gloved hand gripping her elbow just tight enough to steady her. The whole thing lasted maybe 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, the rules he had spent months learning to obey were quietly broken. Margaret gasped, more from surprise than pain, and looked up to see the guard's face inches from hers. For a brief moment, their eyes met. She saw something there she had not expected to see in a man trained to show nothing at all. Concern. Genuine, human concern. "Are you all right?" Oliver asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, careful not to draw too much attention. Margaret nodded, still catching her breath. "Yes, thank you, dear." Oliver gave a small nod, released her arm gently, and stepped back into position, resuming his rigid stance as if nothing had happened at all. His face returned to its usual blankness, but his heart was pounding beneath the red coat. He knew he had broken protocol, he knew there could be consequences, but in that moment he did not regret it. A young tourist named Anna had been standing just a few feet away, phone already raised to capture the ceremony for her travel video. She had not been filming Margaret specifically, but her camera happened to catch the entire moment, from the slip to the catch, to Oliver's brief words. She lowered her phone slowly, staring at the screen in disbelief. She had traveled to dozens of countries, filmed hundreds of tourist attractions, but she had never captured anything quite like this. She did not think much of it in the moment. She simply continued filming the rest of the ceremony, then walked back to her hotel later that afternoon, scrolling through her footage before deciding to upload a short clip online, mostly for her small circle of followers who enjoyed her travel videos. She added a simple caption: "A guard broke formation to help an elderly woman who almost fell. Did not expect to see that today." She did not expect much to come from it. Maybe a few likes from friends, a comment or two. She went to bed that night without giving it another thought. By the time she woke up the next morning, everything had changed. The video had been shared thousands of times overnight. People from all over the world were commenting, tagging friends, expressing surprise and admiration. Some viewers pointed out that they had visited the palace themselves and always assumed the guards were basically living statues, incapable of reacting to anything. Seeing one of them break formation to help someone, even for just a few seconds, struck a chord that Anna had not anticipated. News outlets picked up the story by midday. Headlines called it a heartwarming moment, a rare glimpse of humanity behind the famous stoic guards. Talk shows discussed it. Social media accounts dedicated entirely to feel-good stories reposted the clip with captions praising the guard's instinct to help over his duty to remain still. Oliver had no idea any of this was happening. He had finished his shift that day, changed out of his uniform, and gone back to the small apartment he shared with 2 other guards near the barracks. It was only when his phone would not stop buzzing that evening that he realized something strange was going on. His sister had sent him a message first, "Is this you?" followed by a link. He opened it, expecting some kind of joke, and instead found himself staring at a video of his own face, frozen mid-catch, captured from an angle he had not even noticed at the time. The video had already been viewed more than 2 million times. Oliver sat on the edge of his bed for a long moment, phone in hand, unsure how to feel. Part of him was embarrassed. He had broken a rule that had been drilled into him since his very first day of training. Another part of him, quieter but persistent, felt something closer to relief. He had done the right thing. Whatever happened next, he knew that much was true. His mother called him not long after, her voice trembling slightly with a mixture of worry and pride. She had seen the video shared by half the people in their small hometown by that point, and she wanted to make sure her son was not in some kind of trouble. "Are they going to punish you?" she asked, her concern obvious even through the phone. "I don't know yet, Mum," Oliver admitted. "I have a meeting tomorrow." "You did the right thing," she said firmly, in the tone she always used when she wanted to make sure he understood something completely, the same tone she had used years earlier when teaching him to ride a bicycle or comforting him after a difficult exam. "Whatever they say, you remember that. Your grandfather would have done the exact same thing." Oliver smiled faintly at that, thinking of his grandfather, a quiet man who had passed away when Oliver was still a teenager, but whose stories about honor and service had shaped so much of how Oliver saw the world. His grandfather had never talked about his own time in uniform as though it were about medals or recognition. He always spoke of it in terms of the people he had been able to help along the way, the small moments of decency that had mattered more to him, in the end, than any formal achievement. His father, a quieter man by nature, sent only a short message later that night. "Proud of you, son." It was not much, but from a man who rarely expressed emotion openly, it meant everything to Oliver. He did not sleep particularly well that night, his mind cycling through every possible outcome of the meeting scheduled for the following morning. But beneath the nervousness, there remained a steady, quiet certainty that he had done nothing wrong, regardless of what any official rulebook might say. The following morning, Oliver was called into a meeting with his commanding officer, a stern man named Colonel Whitfield, who had served in the Guard for over 20 years. Oliver walked into the office with his stomach tight with nerves, fully expecting some kind of formal reprimand. Colonel Whitfield sat behind his desk, the video already paused on his computer screen. He gestured for Oliver to sit, studying him for a long moment before speaking. "You know the rules," the colonel said finally, his voice flat and unreadable, much like the expression guards were trained to hold. "Yes, sir," Oliver replied, keeping his eyes forward. "You broke them." "Yes, sir, I did." There was a long pause. Oliver braced himself, expecting the worst. Suspension, perhaps, or at the very least, a formal warning that would follow him for the rest of his career. Instead, Colonel Whitfield leaned back in his chair, and for the briefest moment, something that almost resembled a smile crossed his face before disappearing again behind his usual composed expression. "My grandfather served in this guard," he said quietly. 50 years ago, he used to tell me stories about the old days. Did you know, back then, there was no rule against helping someone in genuine need. The discipline was always about not seeking attention, not performing for the crowd. Somewhere along the way, people forgot the difference. Oliver said nothing, unsure where the conversation was heading. "You didn't break formation for attention," the colonel continued. "You broke it because a woman needed help, and you were the only one close enough to give it. That is not a violation of what this uniform stands for. If anything, it is exactly what it should stand for." Oliver felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he was careful not to let it show too openly. "Thank you, sir." "That said," Colonel Whitfield added, his tone shifting back to something firmer, "I expect you to remain professional. This is not an invitation to start waving at every passing child or striking up conversations with tourists. Understood?" "Understood, sir." Oliver left the office that day with a strange mixture of relief and quiet pride. He had not lost his position. He had not been punished. If anything, it seemed the video had done something unexpected. It had reminded people, even those within the palace itself, of what the guards were truly meant to represent. Margaret, meanwhile, had returned home from her trip a few days later, completely unaware of the attention her small stumble had caused. It was her granddaughter who eventually showed her the video, laughing with delight as she scrolled through the comments praising the kind guard who had caught her grandmother. Margaret watched the clip several times, her eyes misting over each time she saw the young man's face, the careful way he had steadied her, the brief flash of concern before he returned to his silent post. It reminded her so much of the stories her husband used to tell, stories about honor and quiet kindness hiding beneath rigid tradition. She found herself wishing, quietly, that she could thank him properly, beyond the brief words they had exchanged in that fleeting moment. She would get that chance sooner than she expected. About a week after the video went viral, another moment occurred at the palace gates, one that would add fuel to the growing story unfolding in the public eye. A father had brought his young daughter, a curious 4-year-old named Lily, to see the ceremony for the first time. Lily had been talking about the guards for weeks after seeing pictures in a book about castles and kingdoms. She was fascinated, in the way that only young children can be, by the tall black hats the guards wore, convinced they must be magic in some way. Her father, a widower raising Lily mostly on his own since her mother had passed away when she was just a baby, had promised her this trip as a small reward for finally learning to tie her own shoelaces, a task that had taken weeks of patient practice and no small amount of frustrated tears. He had saved up for the train tickets and a modest hotel room, wanting to give his daughter something memorable, something she could look back on fondly as she grew older. The morning of the ceremony, Lily had woken up before sunrise, far too excited to sleep any longer. She had dressed herself in her favorite yellow dress, insisted on bringing her stuffed rabbit along for the trip, and chattered non-stop during the entire walk to the palace about what she imagined the guards might say if they were allowed to talk. Maybe they know secret words, she had told her father earnestly. Maybe that's why they can't talk, because the words are too magic. Her father had smiled and gone along with the idea, charmed as always by the endless imagination of a 4-year-old, convinced the world was still full of magic waiting to be discovered. As the ceremony began, Lily wriggled free from her father's hand and wandered closer to the barrier than she was supposed to, drawn entirely by curiosity toward the guard standing nearest to her. It happened to be Oliver again, still on gate duty, still maintaining his usual composed stillness despite the attention he had received over the past week. Lily stopped directly in front of him, tilting her head back to look up at his tall hat with wide, amazed eyes. "Is that a real bear?" she asked loudly, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the crowd. Oliver, of course, was not supposed to respond. The rule was simple: no reactions, no matter what. But something about the innocent wonder in the little girl's voice softened something in him. He glanced down at her, just briefly, and though he did not speak, he allowed the corner of his mouth to lift into the faintest hint of a smile before returning his gaze forward. Lily's father, embarrassed, quickly scooped her up and apologized, pulling her back toward the crowd. But another tourist standing nearby had captured the small exchange on video, the brief flicker of warmth crossing the guard's face before it vanished behind his usual mask. Later that evening, back at their small hotel room, Lily's father showed her the video someone had tagged him in online, not realizing at first just how many people had already seen it. Lily watched herself on the small phone screen, giggling with delight at seeing her own excited face beside the tall guard, and immediately declared that the guard was now her favorite person in the whole city, perhaps in the whole world. "He smiled at me," she said proudly, again and again, to anyone who would listen over the following days, as if it were the greatest achievement of her young life. Her father later admitted, in a short comment he left beneath the video, that the trip had meant more to him than he expected. Raising Lily alone had not always been easy, and there were days when he wondered if he was giving her enough joy, enough magic, to make up for everything she had lost so early in her life. Watching her light up over something as small as a guard's brief smile reminded him that magic did not always need to be grand. Sometimes it arrived in the smallest, most unexpected moments. This second video spread just as quickly as the first, especially once people began connecting it to the earlier story of the guard who had caught the falling woman. Comments filled with excitement, many pointing out that it appeared to be the same young guard both times. People began referring to him online, with equal parts humor and affection, as the guard with a heart. The attention grew heavier after that. News crews began showing up outside the palace gates, hoping to catch another glimpse of the now famous guard. Oliver found himself the subject of interviews he had never agreed to, photographs taken without his knowledge, strangers approaching members of his family online, hoping to learn more about him. It was overwhelming, and for the first time since joining the guard, Oliver began to feel the weight of unwanted fame pressing down on him. He had never wanted to be known. He had simply wanted to serve, quietly and honorably, the way his father and grandfather had before him. He spoke about this privately with one of his closest friends among the guards, a slightly older man named Henry, who had been serving for nearly 8 years and was preparing to retire from active duty within the month. Henry had seen plenty of change during his time in the guard, and he offered Oliver a perspective that helped ease some of his worry. "You didn't ask for any of this," Henry told him one evening as they sat together in the barracks common room after a long shift. But maybe it's not about you anymore. Maybe it's about what people needed to see. What do you mean? Oliver asked. Henry considered the question for a moment before answering. People have always assumed we're just statues out there, emotionless, distant. Maybe seeing a little humanity reminds them that discipline and kindness aren't opposites, that you can hold a position of duty and still care about the people around you. Oliver turned the words over in his mind long after their conversation ended. He was not entirely convinced, but there was something comforting about the idea that his small, instinctive actions had meant something larger than himself. As it turned out, Henry's own story would soon add another layer to the unfolding narrative capturing public attention. Henry had joined the Guard shortly after finishing his required military service, following in the footsteps of an uncle who had once held the same position decades earlier. Over his 8 years of service, he had grown close to many of the younger Guards, mentoring them through the difficult early months of training, offering quiet encouragement when the discipline felt impossible to maintain. He had met his wife during his 3rd year of service, at a small cafe near the barracks where she worked part-time while studying to become a teacher. She had not known, on their first meeting, that he was a Guard at all, since he had been off duty and dressed in ordinary clothes. It was only on their 3rd date, when she happened to visit the palace with a friend, that she recognized him standing perfectly still among the row of identical-looking Guards and had to fight back a fit of laughter at the absurdity of trying to wave at someone who was, by professional necessity, required to ignore her completely. They married 2 years later, and their son was born the following spring. Henry had often joked that his son grew up more familiar with the sight of his father in uniform than out of it, given how many hours each week the job required. Still, he had never regretted the path he chose, finding a quiet sense of purpose in the discipline and tradition the role demanded, even during the most exhausting stretches of duty. As his 8 years of service drew to a close, Henry found himself reflecting more and more on what the experience had meant to him. He had joined as a young man barely out of his teens, uncertain of much beyond a vague sense of duty inherited from his uncle's old stories. He was leaving as a husband and father, someone who had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that discipline and tenderness were not opposites at all, but two halves of the same quiet strength. His final week of active duty arrived not long after Lily's video had gone viral. Guards did not typically receive any special send-off during their last ceremony. Tradition dictated the same silent, disciplined performance, regardless of how many years someone had served or how significant the occasion might feel to them personally. Henry's family had gathered at the gates that final morning to watch him complete his last official duty. His wife stood at the front of the crowd, holding their young son on her hip, both of them beaming with pride as they watched him march into position alongside the other Guards. The ceremony proceeded as it always did, formal and precise, giving no outward indication that anything unusual was taking place. But as Henry stood in his final position, his eyes briefly found his family in the crowd. For most of his career, he had trained himself never to seek out familiar faces during duty, knowing it only made the stillness harder to maintain. This time, in his last moments wearing the uniform, he allowed himself one small exception. He offered the faintest nod toward his wife and son, so subtle that most of the crowd would never have noticed it at all. But his wife saw it. She always would have recognized that small gesture, even amid 100 identical-looking Guards standing shoulder to shoulder. She began to cry quietly, holding their son a little tighter, watching her husband complete the tradition he had devoted nearly a decade of his life to upholding. A nearby photographer, already present, due to the ongoing media attention surrounding the palace Guards that week, captured the small moment almost by accident. When the photo was later published alongside an article discussing the growing public fascination with the Guards' unexpected displays of emotion, it added yet another layer to the story, capturing hearts around the world. By this point, what had started as a single viral video had transformed into something much larger. News outlets began compiling every similar story they could find, some recent, others dug up from years past, of Guards who had shown small flashes of humanity despite their strict training. A veteran named Thomas, who had served decades earlier in the armed forces, came forward with a story from years prior, describing how a guard had offered him a respectful, lingering glance during a wreath-laying ceremony at a war memorial, a small but meaningful acknowledgement of his service that Thomas had carried with him ever since. These stories, pieced together across news articles and social media posts, painted a picture that resonated deeply with people everywhere. The guards, long seen as symbols of rigid, emotionless tradition, were being reimagined as something more layered and human. People began discussing what discipline truly meant, whether it required the complete suppression of feeling, or whether true strength could include moments of compassion without undermining duty. Online discussions grew more thoughtful as the days went on. What began as simple excitement over a viral video slowly turned into something closer to genuine reflection. People shared stories about their own jobs, their own moments of having to choose between following strict rules and doing what felt right in the moment. Teachers spoke about the times they had broken from lesson plans to comfort a struggling student. Nurses described quietly bending hospital procedure to sit a little longer with a frightened patient. Office workers admitted they had once stepped away from an important meeting to help a coworker who was clearly having a difficult day. The story of the guards, in a strange way, had become a mirror for something much larger than a single tradition outside a palace gate. It touched on a question many people quietly wrestled with in their own lives: the balance between duty and compassion, between the rules they were expected to follow and the human instinct to care for one another, regardless of those rules. A well-known television presenter dedicated an entire segment of her evening program to the story, inviting a historian to discuss the origins of the guards' tradition and how it had evolved over the centuries. The historian explained that the guards had always been symbols of loyalty and protection, first and foremost, long before the emphasis on complete stillness and silence had become such a defining feature of their public image. Somewhere across the generations, she suggested, the discipline required for the role had slowly hardened into something closer to complete emotional suppression, further and further removed from the softer human qualities the role had originally represented. Maybe, the historian said near the end of the segment, what we're seeing now isn't the guards breaking tradition at all. Maybe it's tradition finding its way back to where it started. The comment struck a chord with viewers, and clips from the interview circulated almost as widely as the original videos themselves. The palace itself found itself in an unusual position. For generations, the institution had relied on the guards' silence and stillness as a core part of their public image, a symbol of unwavering loyalty and discipline. Now, quite unexpectedly, it was the small breaks in that silence that were capturing public affection and admiration. Inside the palace communications office, staff were overwhelmed with inquiries. Journalists wanted interviews with the guards involved. Television programs requested behind-the-scenes access to guard training. Ordinary citizens sent letters and messages expressing how touched they had been by the stories circulating online. For several days, the palace remained silent on the matter, uncertain how to respond to a situation that fell outside the usual boundaries of protocol. Some senior officials worried that acknowledging the videos too directly might undermine the discipline the guards were meant to represent. Others argued that ignoring the public's genuine emotional response would be a missed opportunity to show a more relatable side of a centuries-old tradition. Inside a small conference room within the palace administrative offices, a group of senior staff gathered to debate the matter over the course of several long meetings. One official, an older woman who had worked in palace communications for nearly 30 years, argued strongly in favor of staying quiet, insisting that the guards had always maintained their mystique precisely because they remained distant and unknowable figures. Attaching personal stories and names to individual guards, she warned, risked turning a centuries-old tradition into something closer to a passing internet trend, here today and forgotten within weeks. A younger staff member, only a few years into her role, pushed back gently but firmly. She pointed out that the public reaction had already happened, whether the palace chose to acknowledge it or not. The videos existed, the stories were already spreading. The only real choice remaining was whether the palace wanted to be part of the conversation or simply watch it unfold from the sidelines, allowing others to define the narrative in their absence. The debate continued for the better part of a week, with drafts of potential statements written and rewritten several times over, each version carefully weighed for tone and implication. Some worried the palace might appear to be exploiting a touching moment for positive publicity. Others worried that silence itself might be misread as coldness, an unwillingness to acknowledge the very humanity that had captured so much public affection in the first place. It was only after Colonel Whitfield was invited to share his perspective, given his direct involvement in the matter through his conversation with Oliver, that the discussion began to settle. He spoke plainly, without much of the careful diplomatic language typically used in such meetings. "The public already sees the humanity," he said. "We're not creating it by acknowledging it. We're just choosing whether to be honest about something everyone already knows is true." His words seemed to shift the tone of the room, and within a few days, a final version of the statement was approved. Eventually, it was Colonel Whitfield who pushed for a response. He had, after all, been the one to speak with Oliver directly following the first viral video, and he understood better than most just how much the public reaction had touched something real within the institution itself. He drafted a statement, careful and measured, avoiding anything that might seem like the palace was chasing publicity, but honest enough to acknowledge what so many people had already noticed on their own. The statement read simply that the guards were, above all else, human beings first. Their training emphasized discipline and respect for tradition, but it had never been intended to erase their basic humanity. Small moments of compassion, the statement explained, were not violations of their duty, but rather quiet reflections of the very values the Guard was meant to protect and represent. When the statement was released publicly, it was met with overwhelming warmth. News outlets praised the palace for its honest and thoughtful response, a refreshing departure from the usual formal, distant language typically associated with royal institutions. Social media exploded once again, this time filled with people sharing their own personal encounters with the guards over the years, small moments of kindness they had witnessed but never thought much of until now. Margaret, watching the news coverage unfold from her small home outside the city, felt a quiet pull to return to the palace one more time. She wanted to thank the young guard properly, beyond the brief exchange they had shared during her fall. Her granddaughter, moved by her grandmother's story, offered to accompany her back to the city the following weekend. They arrived on a bright Saturday morning, the crowd noticeably larger than usual, many drawn by the same viral stories that had captured the world's attention. Margaret stood near the front of the barrier once again, her cane steady beneath her this time, watching carefully as the guards marched into position. She recognized Oliver almost immediately, despite the identical uniforms worn by every guard in the formation. Something about the careful way he held himself, the same quiet composure she remembered from their brief encounter weeks earlier, gave him away. She waited patiently through the ceremony, and once it concluded, she approached one of the palace staff members stationed nearby to assist visitors. She explained, gently, that she wished to properly thank the guard who had helped her weeks earlier, if such a thing were possible. To her surprise, the staff member disappeared for a few minutes before returning with a small smile, explaining that while guards were not permitted to engage in extended personal conversations while on duty, an exception could sometimes be made following an official shift change. While Margaret waited, her granddaughter wandered a short distance away, watching the crowd slowly thin out after the ceremony. She noticed a man standing near the edge of the square, perhaps in his 60s, wearing a small pin on his jacket that marked him as a veteran. He was watching the palace gates with a quiet, thoughtful expression, the kind of look that suggested memories running much deeper than a simple tourist visit. She approached him gently, curious, and struck up a conversation. His name was Thomas, and he explained that he had come to the city that week for a memorial service honoring soldiers who had served alongside him many years earlier. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he had a story of his own about the guards, one that had happened long before any of the recent videos had ever been filmed. Years ago, Thomas explained, He had come to lay a wreath at a war memorial not far from the palace, honoring friends he had lost during his service. It had been a difficult day for him, filled with grief he had carried quietly for years. As he stood before the memorial, overwhelmed by emotion, he had noticed a guard stationed nearby, someone assigned to a separate ceremonial duty entirely unrelated to his own private moment of mourning. The guard, Thomas recalled, had not said a word. He had not stepped out of position or broken any part of his formal duty. But as Thomas knelt to lay his wreath, wiping tears from his eyes, he caught the guard's gaze for just a moment. There was no smile, no obvious gesture of sympathy, just a steady, respectful look that seemed to acknowledge his grief without intruding upon it. It was such a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone else standing nearby, but it had stayed with Thomas for years afterward. "I never forgot that," Thomas told Margaret's granddaughter. "Sometimes people think respect has to be loud to matter. It doesn't. Sometimes the quietest things are the ones you remember the longest." When Margaret's granddaughter later shared this story alongside the footage of her grandmother's own encounter, it added yet another layer to the growing collection of quiet, human moments that seemed to be surfacing from every corner of the guard's long history. People began searching their own memories, their own old photographs and half-forgotten stories, wondering if they too had witnessed something similar without ever realizing its significance at the time. A short while later, Oliver appeared, no longer in full ceremonial uniform, dressed instead in a simple dark jacket that made him look far younger and more ordinary than the imposing figure Margaret remembered from the gates. He approached her with a slightly nervous smile, unsure exactly what to expect from the meeting. "I wanted to thank you properly," Margaret said, her voice warm and steady despite the emotion clearly present beneath it. "What you did that day meant more to me than you probably realize." Oliver shifted slightly, still unused to receiving this kind of direct gratitude. "I just did what anyone would have done," he replied modestly. Margaret shook her head gently. "Not everyone would have broken years of training in half a second to catch a stranger. That took something special." She paused, her eyes growing slightly distant as she continued. "My husband used to tell me stories about the guards, about the discipline, the tradition, the honor behind it all. He passed away a few years ago, and coming here again, alone, was harder than I expected. When you caught me, it felt like more than just physical help. It felt like a small piece of kindness I desperately needed that day." Oliver listened quietly, moved by her words in a way he had not anticipated. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said softly, "and I'm glad I could help, even if it was just for a moment." Margaret reached out and gently patted his arm, much the way she might have with a grandson. "It was more than just a moment to me. Thank you." Their brief conversation, simple and unremarkable in its own way, would later be shared by Margaret's granddaughter on social media, adding one final, quiet chapter to a story that had already captured the hearts of millions. In the weeks that followed, life outside the palace gates slowly returned to something resembling normal. The initial wave of media attention began to fade, as it always eventually does, replaced by newer stories and fresher headlines competing for public attention. But something subtle had shifted, something that lingered long after the cameras had moved on to other topics. Visitors who came to watch the daily ceremony began arriving with a different kind of attentiveness. Rather than simply snapping quick photographs and moving on, many lingered a little longer, watching the guards not just for their impressive discipline, but with a quiet curiosity about the human beings standing beneath those uniforms. Parents began pointing out the guards to their children, not merely as historical curiosities, but as examples of quiet strength, balanced with compassion. Tourists exchanged stories they had read online, comparing notes about which guard had been involved in which viral moment, though the guards themselves remained, as always, impossible to distinguish from one another during active duty. Oliver continued his service much as he had before, though he could not deny that something within him had changed. The pressure of unwanted attention had faded, but the quiet pride he carried from those brief moments of humanity remained steady beneath his usual composed exterior. He no longer worried quite as much about the rigid perfection of his stillness, understanding now that true discipline was never about erasing his humanity entirely, but about knowing when duty required silence and when it allowed for something more. Henry, now fully retired from active guard duty, often visited the barracks to check in on his former colleagues, sharing stories and offering guidance to newer recruits still adjusting to the demanding training. He liked to remind them, whenever the opportunity arose, that the uniform they wore was never meant to replace the person underneath it, only to represent something they carried alongside their humanity, not instead of it. Colonel Whitfield, meanwhile, found himself reflecting more often on his own grandfather's stories from decades earlier, stories he had once dismissed as simple nostalgia from an older, gentler era. He began incorporating small lessons into his own training sessions with new recruits, emphasizing that discipline and compassion were never truly at odds with one another, no matter how strict the tradition might appear on the surface. Margaret returned home from her final trip to the city with a lightness she had not expected to find. The visit had given her closure in a way she could not have anticipated, a quiet reminder that kindness could still be found in the most unexpected places, even within institutions built entirely around silence and stillness. As for Anna, the tourist whose simple video had sparked the entire chain of events, she continued traveling and filming her adventures around the world, though she often thought back to that particular morning outside the palace gates. She had captured countless landmarks and famous sights over the years, but nothing had ever resonated with people quite the way that brief, unplanned moment of kindness had. She later said, in a short interview with a small travel publication, that the experience had changed the way she approached her own filming. She found herself paying closer attention to the small, unplanned moments during her travels, the quiet interactions between strangers, the brief flashes of kindness that so often went unnoticed in the rush to capture famous landmarks and popular attractions. She began sharing more of these smaller moments in her videos, and to her surprise, they often resonated with her audience just as much, sometimes even more, than the grand sights she had once considered the main attraction of her travels. Colonel Whitfield, for his part, made a small but lasting change to the Guards' training program in the months that followed. While the core discipline remained unchanged, he introduced a brief discussion, early in each recruit's training, about the origins of the tradition and the values it was meant to represent. He wanted every new guard to understand, from the very beginning, that the silence and stillness they were being asked to master was never meant to erase who they were as people, but rather to serve as a quiet vessel for the deeper values of loyalty, respect, and service that the uniform represented. He often thought back to his own grandfather during these sessions, wishing, in a quiet way, that the old man could have seen how his stories had eventually found their way into the training of a new generation of guards, decades after he had first shared them with a young boy who had once sat wide-eyed, listening to tales of honor and quiet duty. Months later, on an ordinary weekday morning, the daily ceremony outside the palace gates continued much as it always had, the same careful marching, the same disciplined stillness, the same tall black hats standing motionless against the gray morning sky. To the untrained eye, nothing about the scene had changed at all. But those who had followed the story closely, who had watched the videos, read the articles, and felt something stir within themselves at the sight of quiet compassion breaking through years of rigid tradition, understood that something meaningful had shifted, even if it remained mostly invisible to the casual observer. The guards still stood in silence. As tradition demanded, they still held their positions with the same unwavering discipline that had defined the role for centuries. But now, scattered throughout the crowd on any given morning, there were always a few visitors who watched a little more closely, searching not for perfection, but for those small, human flickers hidden beneath the uniform. And every so often, though rarely, and never predictably, those flickers still appeared, a steadying hand extended just in time, a brief, warm glance shared with a curious child, a quiet nod exchanged with a familiar face in the crowd. In a role built almost entirely around silence, it turned out that the smallest gestures were the ones that spoke the loudest, echoing far beyond the palace gates, reminding everyone who witnessed them that even the strictest traditions could still leave room for a little bit of heart.